In chapter 17 of the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul is up in the north of Greece, in Thessalonica. Not a popular holiday spot, but Paul proclaims the gospel there, just as he does everywhere else. And he has a bit of a mixed reception. Some people believe him and follow him, but some people don't, and rent a mob are hired to run him out of town. And so Paul goes about 50 miles west, a long way back then, to the town of Berea, where Paul again preached the gospel. And the people in Berea, they listened to Paul, but they did something much more important. They looked up in the Bible whether the things that Paul said were true. And we still talk about the Bereans examining the scriptures today, 2,000 years later. Anyhow, Berea wasn't far enough away to stop the troublemakers from Thessalonica coming over, and Paul is once more run out of town. And so this time he's sent 400 miles south to Athens. Paul is on his own, as his team has stayed up north to sort things out. And Paul's bored, and he hates being bored, and so he takes an open-top bus tour around Athens, and it would have been very similar to today. He would have seen the Acropolis. It was already 600 years old when Paul saw it. And of course, rather more of the Acropolis was in Athens 2,000 years ago than is now. And Paul notices, we're at about verse 16 in Acts 17, that there were temples to many gods in Athens, and one in particular catches his eye, which Paul files away for future use. And so Paul decides to do something. He goes into the market squares in the city of Athens and he proclaims the gospel of salvation through Jesus Christ, just as he always did. And some of the Athenians found him interesting, but others thought he was a babbler. And although Paul spoke perfectly good Greek, because he was talking about something foreign, some thought he was a barbarian. But there was one thing that all the Athenians liked to talk about, and that was something new. And Paul was definitely saying something new. And so he is invited to go to the top of the Areopagus, a rocky outcrop below the Acropolis, historically associated with the government of Athens, and speak to a large crowd so that they can hear what he has to say. We're at verse 22 now. And he says that he can see from his bus tour that people of Athens are very religious. But Paul says that amongst the many temples, he saw one temple that was really unusual. It was to the unknown God. The Athenians had built this temple lest they offend any god that they had forgotten. But Paul says, let me tell you about the God that you do not know. He made everything in heaven and earth. He doesn't live in buildings. God doesn't need us to look after him. No, it's the other way round. He gives everything to us. He created life. He filled the earth with it. And he is a God with a plan. And yet, despite all his majesty, he is never far from us. And then Paul quotes not from the Bible, because he knows that the Athenians have no familiarity with the Bible. No, he quotes from Greek poets, Epimenides and Aratus, because in order to proclaim the gospel throughout the world, Paul has to become all things to everyone, as Paul was to write to the church at Corinth. And these quotes served his purpose. And Paul starts to conclude by saying, because God made us, we can't make God, even if we use gold or silver or stone or the finest artists. But then Paul becomes deadly serious, because he says God is prepared to set aside the fact that the Athenians are ignorant of him, but not indefinitely, because there is a day in God's plan when the world will be judged by a man, God's son. You don't believe he was God's son? Well, he was raised from the dead so that we could be certain about that. Some of the Athenians, when they heard about the resurrection, they mocked. That never happened, they said. But some wanted to hear more, and some of them believed Paul and believed the gospel he preached. So, what do you want to do? Do you want to mock? Many have. Then the day of judgment will come as a surprise to you. Or do you want to hear more? You've come to the right place. And maybe you too will look forward to the day of judgment and what comes after it. It's up to you. Well, thank you for listening to me. You'll find many other similar talks here that will tell you more about the God that maybe you don't know yet, and his Son, and his salvation for you.